Something is happening right now that most Americans aren't connecting, and the pattern is hiding in plain sight. Venezuela got squeezed, Iran got sanctioned into a corner, and every single time the United States has turned up the pressure on a country that dared to build power outside of Washington's reach, outside the dollar, outside the alliance system, outside the rules that America wrote after World War II, that country either broke, bent, or became a crisis we're still managing decades later. So here's the question that nobody on cable news is sitting down long enough to actually answer. Is North Korea next? Is Kim Jong Un watching what happened in Caracas, what's happening in Tehran, and calculating right now how much time he actually has before the crosshairs move? Because the United States doesn't just act randomly. There is a sequence. There is a logic. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let me start with Venezuela, because Venezuela is where the blueprint becomes undeniable. Hugo Chavez spent years telling the world that the United States was running an empire. People laughed at him. International media dismissed him as a loud, theatrical leader who liked to give long speeches and wave books around at the United Nations. But here's the thing. He wasn't entirely wrong about the dynamic he was describing. When Chavez started moving Venezuelan oil wealth away from American financial structures, when he started building relationships with Cuba, with Iran, with Russia, when he started talking about a multipolar world where Washington didn't get to make every single call, that's when things got complicated for Venezuela. That's when the relationship shifted from tense to adversarial. And after Chavez died and Nicolas Maduro took over, the United States didn't ease up. It doubled down. Sanctions, economic pressure, recognition of a parallel government, attempts to flip the military. The whole infrastructure of regime pressure was applied to Venezuela with a consistency and a determination that told you this wasn't reactive, this was intentional, this was policy. And now look at Venezuela today. The economy has been hollowing out for years. Millions of Venezuelans have fled the country, one of the largest displacement crises in the entire Western Hemisphere. The government in Caracas is isolated, exhausted, surviving but not thriving. And here's the part that matters for our conversation tonight. Venezuela never had nuclear weapons. Venezuela had oil. Venezuela had regional influence. Venezuela had defiance. But it didn't have the one thing that might have changed the calculation entirely. Now let's talk about Iran, because Iran is a completely different chapter in the same book. Iran has been living under the weight of American sanctions for decades. Long before the nuclear deal, long before the arguments about enrichment levels and centrifuges and IAEA inspectors, Iran and the United States were already locked in a cold confrontation that stretched back to 1979, back to the revolution, back to the hostage crisis, back to the moment when Iran decided it was going to be an Islamic republic on its own terms, and Washington decided that was unacceptable. Everything that happened after that, the support for Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War, the sanctions architecture that was built layer by layer over the following decades, the maximum pressure campaign under Trump, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani on Iraqi soil, all of it flows from that original break, that original moment when Iran stepped outside the order that America had constructed for the Middle East. And Iran, unlike Venezuela, actually pushed back in ways that made the confrontation far more dangerous and far more expensive for everyone involved. Iran built a network of proxy relationships across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militia groups in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, connections to Hamas. Iran didn't just sit there and absorb the pressure. It built a deterrence architecture of its own. And critically, Iran started developing the capacity that every American national security planner loses sleep over, the nuclear capacity. Not a weapon, Iran always insisted, but the capability, the proximity, the threshold. And here is where it gets genuinely important for understanding what we're watching right now. That nuclear capacity changed the math. It didn't make Iran safe. Iran is still sanctioned, still isolated, still under enormous pressure. But it made a military strike against Iran a proposition that came with terrifying consequences attached. It raised the cost of direct action so high that even the most hawkish voices in Washington had to stop and calculate before reaching for the trigger. Kim Jong Un was watching all of this. He was watching every single bit of it. Because here's what Kim Jong Un knows better than almost any other leader on the planet right now. He knows what happened to Muammar Gaddafi. And if you want to understand North Korea's nuclear logic, you have to start there in Libya in 2003, when Gaddafi made a deal. He agreed to give up his weapons of mass destruction program. He agreed to open his facilities to international inspectors. He cooperated, he dismantled, he handed over the materials and the documents and the equipment, and the West welcomed him back. There were handshakes and business deals and talk of Libya rejoining the international community. And then 8 years later, in 2011, NATO aircraft were flying over Libyan territory, and Gaddafi was pulled from a drainage pipe and killed by a mob. Kim Jong Un watched that. Every North Korean official watched that. And what they took from it, what they concluded with absolute certainty, is that giving up your weapons doesn't buy you safety. It buys you vulnerability. It tells your enemies that the last obstacle to your removal has been cleared. So when American officials and South Korean officials and international mediators sit down and say to North Korea, give up your nuclear weapons, and we'll give you sanctions relief, and we'll give you security guarantees, and we'll open the door to normalized relations, Kim Jong Un hears something completely different. He hears, give up the only thing standing between you and the fate of Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, and trust us that we won't do what we did to every other leader who trusted us. And that's not paranoia. That's a rational reading of recent history. Now, where does this leave the United States? Because America's relationship with North Korea right now is one of the most frozen, most dangerous, most misunderstood standoffs in global geopolitics, and it deserves more serious attention than it typically gets in American political conversation. North Korea has nuclear weapons, verified, tested, real nuclear weapons. It has ballistic missiles that can reach the continental United States. It has continued developing and improving those systems, even through years of sanctions and isolation that would have collapsed most economies on Earth. The North Korean state has an extraordinary capacity to sustain pressure because it was built from the very beginning to do exactly that. The sanctions have not worked in the sense that anyone originally intended. They have not produced the collapse of the Kim regime. They have not produced a popular uprising. They have not produced a military coup. They have not brought North Korea to the negotiating table on terms that Washington would find acceptable. What they have produced is enormous suffering for ordinary North Korean people who have almost no say in any of their government's decisions. But the regime itself, the core structure of power around Kim Jong Un, that has survived. And it has survived precisely because the system was designed to prioritize regime survival above literally everything else, including the welfare of its own population. So here's the strategic problem that the United States is now sitting with. The tools that worked, or at least appeared to work, against Venezuela and Iran have not worked against North Korea. The sanctions are already maxed out. North Korea is already one of the most isolated countries on Earth. There's almost nothing left to take away economically that hasn't already been taken. And the military option, the option that sometimes gets floated in hawkish policy circles, the idea of a preemptive strike to take out North Korea's nuclear capability, that option comes with a consequence so catastrophic that it has effectively been off the table for decades. Because North Korea, even before it had intercontinental ballistic missiles, had thousands of artillery pieces aimed at Seoul, one of the most densely populated cities in the world, sitting just 35 miles from the border. A military strike on North Korea doesn't produce a clean Libya-style intervention. It produces a war that could kill hundreds of thousands of people in the opening hours alone. And that changes everything about the calculus. That's the variable that Venezuela didn't have and that Iran has been trying to build toward. North Korea already has it. North Korea crossed that threshold years ago, and it crossed it deliberately with full knowledge of what it was doing and why. Now, there's another dimension to this that American audiences don't hear enough about, and it involves China in a way that's more complicated than the usual framing. China doesn't actually love having North Korea as a neighbor with nuclear weapons. Chinese officials have expressed concern about the program. China has voted for some sanctions in the United Nations Security Council. The relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang is not the warm alliance that it sometimes gets described as in American political commentary. North Korea is, in many ways, a headache for China, too. But And this is the part that matters. China absolutely does not want North Korea to collapse. Because a collapsed North Korea means one thing above everything else from Beijing's perspective. It means American troops allied with South Korea potentially sitting on China's northeastern border. That is a strategic nightmare for Beijing. That is the scenario that China has been determined to prevent since the Korean War ended in a stalemate in 1953. So China keeps North Korea on life support, not because Beijing loves Kim Jong Un, but because a surviving, stable, nuclear-armed North Korea is, from China's perspective, preferable to the alternative. And that means the United States doesn't just have a North Korea problem. It has a China-North Korea problem wrapped inside a broader U.S.-China competition that is reshaping the entire global order right now. Every move Washington makes toward Pyongyang has to be calculated against how Beijing will respond. Every sanction, every military exercise, every diplomatic overture, it all happens inside this larger triangle, and that triangle makes every option harder and every solution more elusive. So what does the United States actually do? What is the realistic policy option when the standard tools don't apply, when military force carries catastrophic risk, when China won't let the regime collapse, and when Kim Jong Un has spent his entire life studying the fates of leaders who trusted American security guarantees? This is the question that has defeated American administrations from both parties for 30 years. Clinton tried diplomatic engagement and almost got a deal before it fell apart. Bush put North Korea in the axis of evil and watched the nuclear program accelerate. Obama adopted strategic patience, which was essentially a policy of waiting for something to change while nothing changed. Trump had the Singapore summit, the historic handshakes, the letters that he described as beautiful, and the nuclear program continued developing throughout all of it. Biden returned to a more conventional diplomatic stance and got almost no response from Pyongyang at all. None of it worked, not in the way that American policymakers define success. And that consistent bipartisan failure tells you something important. It tells you that this problem may not have a solution that America can impose from the outside. It tells you that Kim Jong Un is not waiting for the right offer. He's not miscalculating about his own interests. He has decided, based on a very clear-eyed reading of what happened to Gaddafi and Saddam and what's happening to countries without nuclear deterrence, that the weapons are the policy. The weapons aren't a bargaining chip to be traded away. They are the foundation of his survival and his regime's survival, and no economic inducement or security guarantee that Washington can credibly offer is going to change that calculation. Which brings us back to the original question of this whole conversation. Is Kim Jong Un the next American target? And the honest answer is, he might be on the list, but he has made himself extraordinarily difficult to target in the way that Venezuela was targeted, in the way that Iran is being targeted. He has deliberately and strategically raised the cost of any serious move against him to a level that gives even the most hawkish American planners pause. But here's what we should be watching carefully, and here's why this matters right now in this particular moment in history. The global order is shifting in ways that are creating new pressures and new opportunities for everyone involved in this standoff. Russia's war in Ukraine has pulled American attention and American resources in a new direction. China's economic relationship with the United States is deteriorating into something that looks increasingly like structural competition. North Korea has been deepening its military cooperation with Russia, supplying artillery shells, potentially workers, taking steps toward a relationship with Moscow that it didn't have before the Ukraine war started. And Kim Jong Un is watching all of these shifts and recalculating his own position within them. A world in which Russia and China are both more confrontational with the United States is a world in which North Korea has more diplomatic cover, more economic lifelines, more room to maneuver. It's a world in which the international coalition for maximum pressure on Pyongyang becomes harder to build and harder to sustain. It's a world in which Kim Jong Un's strategic position, as paradoxical as it sounds, may actually be getting stronger, even as the humanitarian situation inside North Korea remains desperate and the diplomatic situation remains completely frozen. And so when we ask whether Kim Jong Un is the next American target, we're really asking a deeper question about American power and its limits. We're asking whether the strategy that has been applied to country after country, the sanctions, the isolation, the pressure, the demand for capitulation, whether that strategy has found its wall. whether North Korea is the case that demonstrates more clearly than any other where American leverage ends and where the hard, uncomfortable reality of a nuclear-armed adversary that will not be coerced begins. Because the United States has enormous power. No serious analyst disputes that. But power has limits, and those limits are defined not just by what America can do, but by what the other side is willing to absorb and what it is willing to risk in return. And Kim Jong Un, watching Venezuela slowly suffocate, watching Iran survive under maximum pressure with its regime intact, watching Gaddafi die after trusting the West, has made his calculation. He has decided what he's willing to absorb and what he's willing to risk. And that calculation, that cold, strategic, survival-driven calculation, is what makes North Korea the hardest problem in American foreign policy. Not because American power is weak, but because Kim Jong Un has structured his entire existence around making sure that power cannot be applied to him the way it was applied to everyone else. That's the story. That's what's actually happening. And it's happening right now, whether the headlines are covering it or not.